it's Aisha over here and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, what I'm going to be doing is telling you guys about the 7 core health science first year papers as well as the optional 8th paper that I took. I will be telling you guys a little bit about the paper, a general overview, as well as giving you guys a couple of quick tricks on how to study for the papers during the semester. But before I begin, I'd just like to say I am also selling my notes from health science first year that helped me get into medicine and dentistry. So if you are keen on buying those notes for me, head over to my Instagram and DM me and I'll give you guys more detail over there. So the first paper is Cells 191, which stands for Cell and Molecular Biology. So the cells paper is an introduction to the biology of cells. So I know this sounds like a lot, but essentially everything that you're doing here is related to the cells, whether that's human cells, animal cells, or plant cells, as well as learning about diseases and how diseases occur. So that's kind of what cells is about. It provides like a fundamental introduction to cell and molecular biology and genetics. So I have a couple of tips and tricks for Cells 191. The first one is understand the basics. Make sure you have a solid grasp of like the fundamental concepts because cells tends to sort of build on these, so having a stronger foundation is crucial. Second thing is use active learning. A lot of the stuff that you will learn in cells, like there are some processes, there are also parts or aspects of cells where you have to learn the names of things, and that is purely, memorization and active recall. So make sure you're just actively learning and not passively learning, so you just kind of don't look over your notes kind of thing and instead actually engage with the content. That will really help you. So take notes, try summarize information in your own words and try to explain concepts to others, and also practice regularly. So there are a bunch of worksheets and past papers, etc. that are available for you guys to test your knowledge, and so definitely use those and try to find and identify areas where you need more work. Something that I found was I studied going lecture by lecture and how well I understood each of the lecture content, and the lectures that I knew the stuff was just not staying in my head were the lectures that I knew I needed to spend more time on. The next paper that I'm going to tell you guys about is Chem 191, which is the chemical basis of biology and human health paper. Chem 191 is like an introduction to the concepts of chemistry underlying important processes in biology and human health. So I know this sounds like a lot, but a lot of this is kind of just stuff that you've learned in level 2 and level 3 chemistry. It is kind of just a little bit of like a repetition from high school chemistry with a few new objectives. What it does is in the first semester, it provides an introduction to concepts influencing chemical reactions in biological systems, which include the concepts of chemical bonding. So this is something that you would have learned in level 2 and level 3 chemistry at high school. Thermodynamics, the energetics of biological systems. This also you have focused on properties of water. You don't focus on a lot of this in high school, but in uni you do. But it's not too tricky. It's kind of just like talking a few kind of things about the properties of water. You talk about reaction rates and chemical equilibria, which is stuff that you have done in high school. You learn about metals in biology, so you talk about electron transfer, again, a potential standard that you could have taken in high school. You do focus on organic and carbon-based compounds, which is kind of a little bit like organics at high school, but they go much more kind of beyond what you've learned in high school. So the one thing I would recommend is, definitely taking chemistry in high school, especially the organics paper if you can. Like if your school, gives you the option to take or not take organics, I would 110% recommend taking organics. And the other thing that you focus on is biological molecules, because you've got to remember this is a health science, program. So you're going to talk about carbohydrates, amino acids, nucleic acids, proteins, enzymes, etc. And chemistry plays a huge part in all of these. So you do focus on the chemistry aspect of these things. And trust me, this is not the hardest part. The hardest part about this course is definitely the organic section. So definitely, brush up on your organics from high school. And also try to understand the concepts as you go along the lectures and definitely ask. The tips that I have for Chem 191 is do the practice problems. It's more important that you can kind of do the practice problems that they're setting you and the worksheets that they give you and almost prioritize those the most. In certain cases, if you're absolutely running short on time, you would be better off doing practice problems than doing notes. Although I would recommend doing absolutely both. They do help with your learning a lot. Just, even if you just write down, the course content just once, it just helps to kind of retain that information in your mind, which is really important because with the concepts of MCQ questions, it is really easy for them to kind of ask two similar related questions and try and make you guys trip up. So I would definitely recommend having good notes and doing practice problems. I would recommend going to the tutorials that they have where you can go and ask questions, so definitely use those. The biggest thing I would say is learn the method, not just the formulas, because they give you a formula sheet. You have the formulas there, so there's no point just kind of remembering the formulas. Instead, if you can have a formula and you know what kind of numbers you're looking for in a practice question, and you have the method to solve it, I would recommend doing that. And I would definitely say do not fall behind, because chem snowballs, especially in the organic section that you guys have, it keeps building onto itself. So I would recommend, make sure you're keeping up to date with the content, and if you don't understand it, just ask and ask. The only way you can actually improve is by asking questions and doing questions. So the key takeaway is you can only really get good at chem by doing chem. So the next paper that you have is Physi 191, which is the biological physics paper. So essentially it sets the foundations of physics for the health sciences, including mechanics, properties of fluids and solids, thermodynamics, optics, electrostatics, and DC circuits, and the radiation and health topic. So there's a couple of topics that you focus on in biological physics. The main tips that I have for this paper is go to the drop-in sessions again. It kind of, when you don't know how to solve a question, it is really helpful to go to the people and ask them for help. And I would recommend going earlier in the semester. So, as soon as you have a question, definitely go. If you let it pile up, really close to the exams, they get really busy and you kind of are not able to get the maximum help that you could have gotten if you went earlier. So I would definitely recommend going to the drop-in sessions. I would say obviously do practice questions, and closer to the exam period, start doing those practice questions under time pressure. And related to this, also make a formula sheet relatively early. So Physi 191 is one of the only papers in health science where you actually get to make a cheat sheet or formula sheet for yourself. So they do give you a formula sheet as well, but essentially they allow you to make a double-sided A4 piece of kind of help sheet. They don't like to call it cheat sheet, but it essentially is one. And any questions that you don't really know how to do, I would recommend putting it on there, because going into the exam, at least if you have the working there on how to solve the question, even if you don't understand it, you might still be able to solve it. So definitely start doing practice questions, start making your formula sheet. And this is just so you don't really miss out on anything that would be useful to put on the formula sheet, when you're kind of pressured to study for the exams. The next thing I would say is, as much as I'm saying that it's really important that you know how to do the calculations, understanding the concepts is even more important. Sometimes you might not be able to kind of, understand the concepts, just the first time you watch the, sometimes you might not be able to just understand the lecture content the first time you hear it or see it. So definitely rewatch it if you would like. But something that I would do, but I would genuinely recommend the textbook for physics that they have, the biological physics textbook, because some of the explanation for some of the topics that they have in there I found really useful, and that helped me to receive the best marks I could in Physi 191. So those are my kind of tips and tricks for Physi 191. The key takeaway here would be physics is very learnable with repetition. So definitely, engage with the lecture content, maybe, back it up with a bit of textbook knowledge, do the practice questions that they have, past paper questions, they have a lot of those, do questions from your textbook, and, just do as much physics as you can, because I feel like physics is actually a very forgiving paper out of all your health science first year papers. The next paper is HUBS 191, which is your human body systems paper for the first semester. So it is essentially an introduction to the structure and function musculoskeletal, nervous, endocrine, and immune system in our body, and also to some biostatistics. Now trust me, this biostatistics is not too complicated. It's just a couple of lectures focusing on very simple kind of concepts, and there is a lot of repetition involved, so do not worry if you haven't taken stats at high school. The tips that I have for Hubs 191 is to draw diagrams repeatedly. There are some diagrams that the lecturers will use, and pretty much with Hubs, anything that is on the slides and said by the lecturers is examinable unless they have clearly stated that it is not. So if there is a diagram on there that is looking kind of complicated, I would definitely recommend, drawing it, or like even sketching it and annotating it, just so you kind of have it in your brain, so that when you get in the exam, it's not just like a blurry image, but instead you're kind of able to kind of understand and remember what was on the diagram efficiently. Similar to that, label the anatomy from memory. So if you can, maybe you've learned specific bones of the body or something like that, I would print out a little skeleton and kind of label those just from memory and go through them. The next thing I would say is really try to understand the lab content. It just reconsolidates the lab information and the lecturer's information, and there's also just some new information that is told in the lab, so I would definitely focus on the labs, especially the stuff that was mentioned in both the lectures and the labs, because that's some repeated information which suggests that it is important. So now I'm going to move on to the semester 2 papers. So with Hubs 192, it is an introduction to the structure and function of the human integumentary system, which is your skin, cardiovascular, respiratory, gastrointestinal, renal/urinary, and the reproductive systems. Tricks and tips that I would recommend for Hubs 192 are similar to Hubs 191, but on top of that, I would just like to say, stay on top of the content. It ramps up really quickly. The content is a lot more heavy. The content load is a lot more heavy in Sem 2 than it is in Sem 1, so definitely stay on top of it. Also, understanding the physiology part of things is really important, and memorization will only get you so far. So definitely understanding over memorization. And I would say that practice explaining processes out loud. For example, if we're talking about spermiogenesis, which is like the production of sperms, or oogenesis, which is like, the process of the production of the eggs in the females, just practice explaining those processes out loud, because Hubs has many essay components which might ask you to explain these processes. So if you can pretty much explain them out loud, you could probably write it down on a piece of paper. And I would say that in the exam season, definitely practice writing exams. So the key takeaway that I have for Hubs 192 is understanding systems as a whole matters more than memorizing facts. If you think you have the whole thing down, that is kind of when I would start memorizing those little facts. But just remember that, you learn a lot of content, and the lecturer can only examine you on so much. So the high yield stuff would definitely be the stuff that they talked about more in the lectures. The next paper is Bio 192, which is the foundations of the biochemistry paper. So it is essentially an introduction to the structure and function of proteins as essential elements of life processes. Bio is biochemistry. It focuses on metabolism, enzymes, pathways, and molecular processes. So it overlaps a little bit with cells and some chemistry, but it goes much deeper than both of those papers and much faster as well. So in terms of how to do well in Bio 192, it is really important that you understand pathways and not just memorize them. So it's important that you know kind of why each step happens and where it happens, because if you only memorize names, the exam will catch you out. And this is because in the exam itself, you do get like these formula sheets which kind of shows you the pathways and the specific names of the enzymes and this like the intermediate products that you have, etc. So if you're memorizing those names, you're kind of not understanding anything because they give you those things. So it's much more important that you can kind of understand why each of the step happens, and why it's really important that it happens in that specific part of the process, and that's just pretty much so that it allows the next process to happen. So I would recommend drawing the pathways from memory. It doesn't hurt to memorize the names as well as understanding what they do. So redrawing those pathways, especially during exam season, really helps. Try to make big picture summaries. So, as soon as you learn a topic, try to understand what you're doing in it and make summaries of, what exactly did you learn and why is it important. And the biggest thing I would recommend is even leading, like, not during exam season, but still in the semester before exams happen, you can still do past exams. But the thing is that BIOC 192 provides you with a lot of worksheets, like weekly worksheets. So I would definitely recommend doing those, because BIOC exams kind of repeat styles of questions, and they focus on kind of like explaining processes and steps clearly. So it's really important that you do those worksheets and those past papers earlier on, just so you understand how much detail is expected from you, so that you're learning that much and you're kind of not overcrowding your brain with extra information that isn't required. So the biggest takeaway that I would say is don't leave BIOC revision till late. A lot of people in my year actually found that BIOC was maybe their worst paper, or that's what they said. But essentially that's because this paper builds on itself really quickly, and so if you start to fall behind, it does get a bit stressful to catch up. So BIOC is definitely manageable if you understand the systems, not if you cram. So definitely, when you're studying those during the semester, when you're studying the BIOC lectures, do try and understand exactly what you're doing. So the next paper is Pop Health 192, or the Population Health paper. It is essentially just an introduction to the science of epidemiology, the study of the distribution and determinants of health and disease in human populations, and to different ways of understanding health. So epidemiology, I guess the best way to explain it without going into too much detail right now, is kind of understanding what and how diseases are spreading by looking at number of cases. So it is really important to understand how deadly or how much a disease is spreading, how many deaths it's causing, and if you're coming up with vaccines when you're doing those trials, if they're working or not. So it's really important that you're looking at the numbers, and that's kind of what Pop Health focuses on for the second half, or the next kind of like the last 2/3 of the paper. The first third, or the first half, sort of focuses more on the human experience of disease and health, and what good health is for just people, Pakeha people, just people in general, and then also focusing on Maori and Pacifica view on health and some of their models of health. For example, the Te Whare Tapawha, which you would have learned at high school health, which is the 4 pillars of the house and those things. So personally, I actually really liked this paper. A lot of people don't really like it, and they recommend taking an 8th paper just to replace Pop Health. But generally, if you treat this paper nicely, it will treat you nicely as well, is the best way I could put it. So tips to do well would include memorize definitions word for word. I would say this is a very memorization based paper. I guess it takes the first couple of goes to understand what you're doing, but once you sort of understand the content relatively quickly, just try and memorize it, because in exams, they don't know if you understand it or kind of thing. At the end of the day, they're just kind of marking what is written down. So if you can memorize a good answer, they will give you the marks. Also, I would recommend practicing and interpreting the graphs and tables, but don't worry too much about this, because you have your weekly tutorials, which I talked, but don't worry too much about this, because you have your fortnightly tutorials, which I talked about in a previous video, and they go into this deep, and they explain how to interpret all of this stuff. So it definitely starts to make sense, and you know how to do it by the time exams come around. I would also recommend doing the readings, especially for modules 1 and 2. So they do have some recommended, or kind of readings that they say you should do, and I would definitely recommend doing those, especially for modules 1 and 2, where they focus on the human experience of health. And this is because those 2 modules, you have to write an essay about them. So if you've done the readings, you are better able to write a good essay, because you also have to kind of reference your readings, and they should be able to tell that you've read the readings without you directly sometimes quoting stuff. So, just making sure that you're doing the readings whilst simultaneously going to the lectures really helps to kind of make ideas flow for writing the essay. And this is coming from someone who got a really good mark in their essay, so I would definitely recommend that. And so I would definitely say do not underestimate Pop Health. It can give you really easy marks if you are prepared. So the key takeaway is it can be a really good GPA booster if you treat it seriously. So those were the 7 core papers for health science first year. And what you also have the option of taking is an optional 8th paper. And for me, I had taken stats in high school, so I thought the best option for me would be to take Stat 115, which is an Introduction to Biostatistics paper. This is obviously a paper for students that are in health-related subjects, and in particular, nutrition, food science, epidemiology, exercise science, etc. Like one of my friends who was doing marine science, she also took biostatistics. So there's just a range of people that take this paper, as well as people who are studying statistics as their major. But essentially, the topics that are covered include the nature of random variation, concepts of bias and confounding, different types of study designs, data description including risks and odds, binomial and normal distributions, which you would have definitely covered in high school, I think, if you took stats, estimation, hypothesis testing, regression, and all these other things. As well as this, there is a software called RStudio, which is used for your weekly assignments. So, there is a huge focus on RStudio as well. So, as well as learning all these different concepts, you should also understand how to kind of calculate some of the numbers using RStudio. In terms of how to do well in statistics, is learn the logic behind the tests. Essentially, it's a lot of, simple code. Like, you don't have to do full-on Python coding or, that kind of software engineering type of coding. It's just simple code, but make sure you understand how to do those. So understand why you use a test, what the assumptions are, and why they matter, and what kind of output you would get when you would do a test on RStudio. And don't just memorize the formulas because they give you a formula sheet. So it doesn't hurt to memorize the formulas, but your aim shouldn't be to just memorize them. It should be to understand them, so that when you get a question in the exam paper, you know exactly how to use the formula. The other thing I would say is you should definitely practice interpreting questions. The exams love to give you little scenarios, graphs, and sometimes even real life data or made up data. It doesn't really matter, but you should be able to kind of translate the question into steps and how to take away specific information from a blurb that they've given you. So definitely do practice questions and spend time translating the question into steps. Do a lot of practice problems. Stats only really clicks in after repetition. I would also recommend redoing the assessment questions, redoing the assignment questions that you get weekly, and time yourself closer to exams and really try to be quick. So key takeaway is Stat 115. It really rewards understanding and practice and not memorization. So that is the biggest thing. As well as that, what I really liked about Stat 115 is a lot of the content that we focused on in this paper overlapped with Pulp Health 192. And so because of this overlap, it felt like I was just studying the same thing twice, which was really useful for, repetition, so that my brain could kind of, register that. And so if you are someone who kind of wants to do well in Pulp Health as well, I definitely prioritized Pulp Health. So when I was understanding the concepts in Pulp Health, I was sort of able to kind of apply them into Stat 115 as well, and vice versa. So I would definitely recommend taking Stat 115 for that reason. A lot of my friends took Multi, I think it was Multi 1110, and they said that it was a really good paper as well. It was kind of a really good GPA booster. So ultimately, it is up to you. I personally chose stats because I had taken stats before and I thought that it would be helpful. It was helpful, but not a lot. Even if you didn't take stats at high school, you could definitely still do really well in this paper if you are hardworking and you put in a lot of work. Obviously, you don't need to put in as much work as your 7 core papers, but if you do put in a fair bit of work for stats, you will definitely be rewarded. So yeah, guys, that's all about the different health science papers, as well as the optional 8th paper, and I guess some tips and tricks to help you guys study for these throughout the year. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and please hit that thumbs up button, as well as, write down any of the questions you might have in the comment section below. Don't forget, I'm also selling my notes, so head on over to my Instagram if you are keen for more information. And yeah, stay tuned for the next video. Bye bye!